For 13 years, one transmitter tapped its way up and down the world's shortwave bands, wrecking radio traffic on every continent, and the country sending it never once admitted that the thing existed. It began in July 1976, when a radio operator in Miami Springs, Florida, called his head office in New York to ask an awkward question. Andy Clark ran a commercial station that kept shortwave contact with long-haul airliners. And for days, something had been tapping across his frequencies, a hard, repetitive knock, roughly 10 times a second, walking straight over the voices he was trying to hear. New York had it too. In his words, the thing was raising hell with the airplanes. They simply could not contact some of them. I went back through the monitoring reports and the trade magazines from those years, and what stays with me is not how loud this signal was. It is that the people who eventually worked out what it was doing were not governments or intelligence services. They were hobbyists working at home. This is what operators were actually hearing. Somebody recorded it off the air on the 2nd of November 1984, while an American time station was trying to read out the time underneath it, and released the tape into the public domain. I ran that tape through my own analysis rather than trusting the numbers printed in the books. 221 taps, spaced 93 milliseconds apart, which works out at about 10 7/10 of a tap per second. Amateurs had already given the thing a name by then. They called it the Woodpecker. The knocking did not sit still. It moved between about 5 and 22 megahertz, riding the frequencies that the upper atmosphere happened to be reflecting best at that hour high at dawn, lower by mid-afternoon. A monitoring station run by the British Home Office logged its effects from 4 megahertz up to nearly 27, which is very nearly the whole of shortwave. It hopped in steps of about 100 kilohertz, settling on a frequency for anything from 30 seconds to 10 minutes before moving on. You could not plan around it, and you could not outweight it. Amateur operators lost whole bands. At one stage, the 14 megahertz band was simply obliterated. International broadcasters found their programs buried under the tapping. Ships lost their traffic, and the aviation circuits over the oceans went the same way. Complaints were reaching the American regulator within weeks of the first reports, mostly from radio amateurs who had nowhere else to take them. Engineers who measured the strength of the thing kept arriving at numbers in the tens of megawatts. The chief engineer of the BBC's external services was quoted putting it at 20 or 40 megawatts, perhaps more, audible in every part of the globe. Complaints went up through national regulators to the international body in Geneva that registers who is allowed to use which frequency. The British went further and complained to the Soviet authorities directly. What came back was that tests were being conducted and that steps were being taken to reduce the interference. That is the closest thing to an admission anybody extracted at the time, and read carefully. It admits to nothing at all: no transmitter, no location, no purpose. Into that silence went every theory you would expect. People at the time genuinely proposed Soviet mind control and weather modification and a system for talking to submarines. The most popular idea was that Moscow was deliberately jamming the West, which is the sort of explanation that feels right in 1977 and falls apart the moment somebody checks it. Monitoring surveys showed Radio Moscow getting hit exactly as badly as the BBC. Nobody jams themselves that thoroughly on purpose. The engineers were not fooled for very long, to be fair to them. By February 1977, a British electronics magazine had already printed the sober verdict that over-the-horizon radar seemed far more probable than any of it, and plenty of amateurs had said the same thing from the earliest reports. Knowing roughly what a signal is, though, is a long way from proving it. Nobody outside the Soviet Union could point at the transmitter, and nobody could read what it was saying. Some operators decided to fight back, which is my favorite part of this whole story. Wayne Green, who published a large American amateur magazine, ran an editorial telling readers to transmit properly spaced dots back on the radar's own frequency. His theory was that the screen somewhere in Russia would blank out, the operators would utter some Russian oaths, and the frequency would change. Hams in Texas organized for precisely this and named themselves the Russian Woodpecker Hunting Club. Did any of that actually work? A Daytona Beach amateur called Robert Haviland said the hard part was hitting the right frequency at the right dot speed, but that done properly, a shift in frequency of the woodpecker comes very quickly. Receiver manufacturers, meanwhile, smelled a market. By 1984, you could buy a box whose entire job was to notice the tap coming and mute your receiver for a few milliseconds, several times a second, all day long. An industry had grown up around a transmitter that officially did not exist. Then, in April 1982, a letter appeared in that same British magazine that did something nobody else had managed. Peter Martinez, an amateur in Gosport on the south coast of England with the callsign G3PLX, had come across the pulses on a laboratory spectrum analyzer and stored the waveforms on a transient recorder, a device that catches a very short event and holds it still so you can look at it properly. What he saw when he looked was a pulse 3.1 milliseconds long, and it was not smooth. Along the top of each pulse were tiny glitches, and the gaps between them were always multiples of 100 microseconds. The pattern was identical from one pulse to the next, which told him it was not noise and not accident. Martinez read each glitch as the moment the transmitter flipped its wave upside down, assigned a 0 to the first slot, and wrote out what he got. 31 bits, the same 31 bits over and over, buried inside a signal that had been annoying the planet for 6 years. That sequence was not random. It is what engineers call a maximum length sequence, and you can generate the whole thing with a 5-stage shift register wired to feed back from the 3rd and 5th. Stages are circuits small enough to sketch on the back of an envelope. I rebuilt that circuit in software to check him, and the 31 bits it produces are the same 31 bits he published, allowing for where you start reading and which way round you call the zeros. He then found 3 more codes of the same length on different feedback taps, which implied 4 transmitters. Monitors had already suspected exactly that. Here is why that mattered. If you want a radar to see something small a very long way off, you need an enormous amount of energy and a very short pulse, and those two demands fight each other. The trick is to send a long pulse with a code stamped along it, then slide a copy of that code against what comes back until the two line up. Everything that matches collapses into one narrow spike. Everything that does not match stays flat. Martinez worked out that the woodpecker was doing precisely this, with a code step of 100 microseconds, which sorts targets into bins about 15 kilometers deep. He also got a piece of the arithmetic wrong, said so himself, and printed the correction in a later issue. The improvement was the square root of 31. He wrote, rather than 31 itself. Honestly, that small paragraph is the part of this I find most admirable. A man working alone had reverse-engineered a Soviet military radar from its leakage into his own hobby, and the thing he rushed back into print about was his own error. The transmitter he had been reading is still standing in northern Ukraine, about 12 kilometers from the Chernobyl nuclear plant. It is called Duga, the Russian word for arc, a wall of steel roughly 150 meters tall and something like half a kilometer long, weighing some 14,000 tons, hidden inside a closed town that did not appear on Soviet maps. Western intelligence had its own codename for it. The receiving array sat here. The transmitters were about 60 kilometers away, so the two halves could not deafen each other. Its job was to watch for American missiles before they cleared the horizon. Ordinary radar cannot do that because the Earth curves away and radio does not bend with it. What Duga did instead was fire enormous power up at the ionized layer above the atmosphere and bounce the beam back down beyond the curve, which buys you minutes of warning that no line-of-sight installation could offer. Those minutes were the whole point. Soviet early warning satellites were not yet a working network when this was designed. In April 1986, reactor number 4 failed a few kilometers up the road, and the whole district became an exclusion zone. The radar sat inside it. I want to be careful here, because this is where the internet reliably goes off the rails. The accident and the array were neighbors, and that is the entire relationship between them. The tapping thinned out over the following years and stopped in 1989. No official reason for switching it off has ever been published. The likeliest explanation on the record is fairly boring: satellites had finally caught up, and a satellite tells you immediately, cannot be jammed, and does not care what the atmosphere is doing that afternoon. Peter Martinez, meanwhile, kept going. In December 1998, he introduced a mode called PSK-31, built so that two amateurs could hold a conversation using barely any power at all, and it is still one of the standard ways to work the world on a quiet band. The man who pulled the code out of the Soviet radar spent the rest of his hobby making faint signals readable. His Woodpecker is a listed monument now, rusting quietly in the zone with nobody to switch it on, though I should tell you how this actually ends. Since 2019, Russia has had a new over-the-horizon radar on combat duty near Mordovia, and amateurs hear it between 9 and nearly 20 megahertz at about 40 taps a second. They say it sounds like the old one.